Okay, I am here live with Jay Warner Wallace, and we're going to be talking about the Jesus effect. At least that's what I'm calling it. This is unknown stuff about Jesus that it seems it should be obvious, like everybody should know this. So that's why I'm like, how did we miss this? How did we not see that Jesus' impact on history? See, the thing is, let me just preface it this way: we grow up, we hear about Jesus. It's Christmas time right now, so we're hearing all these stories about Jesus, and we think we know, and it's like that keeps us from actually realizing what we're looking at. And so what we're going to do here is allow J. Warner Wallace to talk about his new book, Person of Interest, which I got right here, and some of the stuff that's in the book here. Let me so you guys can actually see it. That actually talks about some lesser known ways that Jesus has radically shaped and changed the world we live in today. And I find this stuff exciting because I love Jesus. I think Jesus is amazing, but none of us appreciates him enough. And so, yeah, maybe you could just by way of introduction, just tell us a little bit about yourself, Jim, and your book.
Yeah, I was somebody who was missed a lot about Jesus. As a matter of fact, when we got saved, I was about 35. Susie was 33, my wife, and we had been together about 18 years. And neither one of us, after we started going to church and realized, we're interested in this person named Jesus of Nazareth. And this is before we were ever really even Christians. We were just kind of investigating it. We wondered, how is it we got that far along without anyone ever really, maybe the last 3 years, people I started inviting us to church. But growing up as a kid here in Southern California in Los Angeles County, I just, the kids I hung around with, the people I bumped into, I just didn't have any sense that I was missing anything. The culture here was secular enough that I felt very comfortable as a non-believer. And so I never associated Jesus as, in other words, he never stuck out to me as having any relevance to my life. He might be important to Christians the same way that Buddha is important to Buddhists. But okay, that's a very niche-y thing, right? Like I'm not
Yeah,
into comic books. My son isn't into comic books, but I'm not. So I don't really care what happens to comic book characters, right? So that's kind of how I saw him. He just was
that's
not.
and you were an atheist at the time, right?
Oh yeah, and I was
Yeah.
the kind of guy who was just not. I was not. I don't want to say angry. That's a stupid expression. I think it's overused all the time. Angry atheist. It wasn't that. It's just that I was impatient with any form of stupid. And when
Yeah.
you work investigations, you encounter a lot of stupid
Yeah.
people who don't want to cooperate, people who are just lying to you for 30 years after they did something terrible. And I just kind of figured I don't need another level of stupid. And
Hmm.
when Christians would kind of even offer at work, so even say something about God, I was very happy to smack it down. And I was, before I became a Christian, I was pretty profane and sarcastic and all the other stuff. So it was a transformational process for me, of course.
Yeah.
But back then, I would have said, "Hey, don't even start your stupid conversations about Jesus because
Yeah.
I'm not interested." And
Yeah.
by the way, and you're not really interested either because if you were, you'd know how to defend this, and you don't know how to defend this. You don't even know what you're talking about. So don't bother. Don't waste my time. That was
Yeah.
my view.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. So you'd probably shut down a lot of people with that kind of stuff.
Well, only
Yeah.
because, we see a lot of this right now in the culture, right? This kind of open. I mean, look, I do videos. I'm sure you're seeing that there's a reaction video for a lot of the videos we do out there from some atheist
Oh yeah.
who will beat you with a stick, and make you look silly in his thumbnail and all that. Okay, that's fine. But that was a view that I think I held. I can see my own. I never get. I never complain about that kind of attitude when I see it because man, I sure
Mm.
personified it for a number of years. So
Yeah. Yeah. So okay, what I'm picking up is the idea that so in your mind, Jesus is sort of previously relegated to like Sunday school and sort of this religious hobby some people have that you just don't
right.
have any interest in. But I think your current book and the work you've done recently is saying even beyond that, there are like your world, your personal life has been radically impacted and shaped by the life of Jesus, whether or not you have even been aware of it.
Yeah.
And so it's not a discussion of like Clark Kent and Superman and Marvel characters and who's stronger, Thor or the Hulk or something like that, but
Yeah.
rather
Yeah.
this is like we're talking about areas of science and history and medicine and things like this that have been radically impacted by the life of Jesus.
Yeah. I mean, as a matter of fact, all the stuff that I valued the most because of my background before I became a police officer was I was in the arts. So I got a bachelor's degree in design, and then I got a master's in architecture, and I was working as an architect in Santa Monica. I was about 27 when I decided to change careers. And so I ended up following in the footsteps of my dad. But the things that mattered to me in grad school would have been, art, because I loved the arts, literature, because we love to read. I wanted to be a journalist, so I wanted to be an author when I was in undergraduate school, but I ended up in the fine arts. I would have said that probably music, because I was somebody who thought I would be I thought of being another, the next Eddie Van Halen, and all that stuff. And also, I would have said education, because I spent most of my young life in it. I was 27 when I finally got out of grad school. I worked the last 3 years of grad school as an architect. Then I would have also said that science is important, because I was part of that Star Trek first generation kind of worldview
Yeah.
growing up. I mean, I remember watching the lunar landing and thinking, man, whatever questions we have, we are on the precipice
Yeah.
of answering all of them. And so I would have, I think the more we actually dig into those things, the further we find ourselves. But
Yeah.
still, I would have thought back then that these 5 things, art, literature, music, education, and science, for me as an atheist, were the things that made life worth living. It turns out, had no idea. I think we do that even in our country, right? We live in this country with all these benefits and all these blessings. We take them all for granted. The technology we take for granted. When there's people in the world who don't have any idea of the kind of experience we have of our freedoms, or even of our kind of lavish extravagances, and you just take it for granted after a while. Where does all that come from, right?
Mhm.
Same thing here for me, as I had no idea of the impact of Jesus and his followers in any of those disciplines.
Yeah. Well, walk us through it. Like this is what my dad used to say. You got the talking part done. So it's like,
Yeah.
we made some claims. And I imagine there's going to be some skeptics and atheists that are going to
Sure.
watch this. And I'm glad you guys are here. And actually, more often than not, I get along great with skeptics and atheists when they're not. That's the minority of them that are calling me horrible names on Twitter.
Yeah, exactly.
Other than
Yeah.
that group. But for those people, like, how could you establish without just say, oh, okay, you just believe it because you believe it because you believe it, that these unknown things about Jesus, about his impact in say art, for instance, what would you say is the testable impact of the life of Jesus in art?
Well, part of it is, I want you remember everything we do when we talk about how much, like, who's the greatest football player of all time. If we say who's the greatest of all quarterbacks, the GOAT, well, people would say it's Tom Brady. Well, then you're going to have arguments based on not just Tom. He's not in isolation in history of football. There's a
Mhm.
ton of other quarterbacks who played the game. So the question is, why is it that Tom Brady then you would consider to be the GOAT when compared to all the other quarterbacks? Something similar happens here, right? We're making a claim about Jesus, and his impact has to be measured against every other living human being, every other historical figure in the history of historical figures. Now, I realize there's a lot of skeptics who will say he's not a historical figure. We can argue that, but okay, look at it this way: if there's another fictional character that you think has had the impact of Jesus of Nazareth, you either just don't understand the impact that Jesus has had.
Mhm.
There is no other fictional character who is at the bedrock of art, literature, music, education, and science, whose followers developed an entire worldview that changed the planet. There is no other fictional character who can make that claim. That's why it's reasonable to infer that Jesus is something other than a fictional character. If you cannot find a parallel, it may be because there isn't any.
Right.
Now, interestingly, I'm comparing Jesus to other historical figures. So when it comes to the arts, for example, the kind of impact Jesus had on the arts, the question becomes, well, okay, I'm comparing him to every other historical figure who's ever lived.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me who's been painted, sculpted, crafted, etched, drawn more than Jesus of Nazareth. And I looked at this, and I love art history. And most of my books now, some are in the rafters because I've moved in different directions. But I used to love art history because, number one, all artists are always kind of being inspired by prior generations and kind of stealing from the ideas of the masters.
Right.
So we have to know what the ideas of the masters were before we can steal them. So I'm constantly looking at the masters. And in every single genre of art history, from antiquity all the way to Impressionism to Dadaism to pop, whatever you want to call, if you look at the masters in those genres, the top three, just use a simple secular Google search. You are going to find a list of the top 3 to 5 artists. Okay, take those, write that down. Search their catalogs of everything they've ever painted, etched, sculpted, drawn. Guess what you're going to find in every single one, somewhere in there? If it's Andy Warhol, if it's Salvador Dali, I don't care who it is. You are going to find that they have been inspired and either painted, sketched, sculpted, or crafted Jesus of Nazareth. Now, why is that? Well, is there any other historical figure who is in everyone's catalog? No. They're not even a close second. What is it? And I don't care. These are not always people who are Christians.
Yeah.
But they find themselves doing something with the person of Jesus. The same is true in music, by the way. And you got a lot of folks who would write music about Jesus that's pretty profane.
Yeah.
So, but he's in, and I'm not saying they're using him as a cuss word. I mean, they're actually calling him out as a historical figure and belly aching about him in some way.
Yeah.
Or using him to mock somebody else. Like there's a Frank Zappa a song called Jesus Thinks You're a Jerk. That's one of my favorite examples of all the kinds of songs that are out there. But the point is that you're not going to find a parallel of any other historical figure.
Yeah.
But that's not even the least of it. It's that the music that you love right now, if you're listening to us, I don't care what genre it could be in, if it's techno or rap or hip hop or country or whatever your thing is, it's K-pop, whatever it is. It turns out that it is standing on a history that was developed largely by Christ followers in a worldview that is musical from the get-go, right? The Jewish faith was a musical faith. David wrote psalms. He wrote songs. And these, for example, we think that Jesus is even singing one of these at the end of the Lord's Supper. And then Paul tells us that you're to sing these spiritual songs and hymns. And then you have a rich tradition. Where else can you think about it in the West? Where people get up every weekend and sing on a stage in front of a live audience. You're surprised that so many pop stars started their singing careers in the church. Mm-hmm. This is a singing worldview and a singing tradition. And because it is early on, the development of hymns, moving from the way people used to sing in antiquity to harmonies. Oh, Christian invention. Minor scales, major scales. Oh, musical notation. Oh, there you go. You cannot turn a corner to get from there to here in which there wasn't a Christian either fashioning an idea about music, a strategy for how to execute the music, or creating the instruments that were going to be used in the music, because these were being sung in the church or in front of the king or wherever it may have been. And then it slowly moves in the part of the Christian tradition from these exclusive audiences of the religious to more secular. And then you have, so if I went back to the catalog of all the 100 top artists in the last 100 years on IMDb, on Rolling Stone, on Billboard magazine, and if you look at the top singers, all but two, and there's about 150 by the time you blend all these lists. Wow. I went to all their catalogs, all but two, and I've got a list of all the songs they've sung about Jesus. So it's not just that he's had huge impact. If you just look at the songs in the first 300 years of the Common Era, you can reconstruct, the story of Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection. Much of the rich theology is available. There are still churches around the world that are singing that. I've got a list of all those hymns in the first 300 years in the book. I was amazed. I went through all the hymns then, of the most ancient hymns, and some of them are pretty ancient and bizarre. And I just mined out what's the data about Jesus you can get. I made a list of what you can know about Jesus from the earliest music. Mm-hmm. And you'll be amazed at what you can learn. So I think now we can say, well, you're talking about Western art. You're talking about, no, actually, in the book, I've got an A to Z list of art globally. Here's something that is hidden in plain sight for a lot of people. What makes Jesus so accessible to artists is the freedom that we've had always to reimagine him and reinterpret him in our cultural context, unlike other religious iconic figures. So if you're going to paint Indra or Buddha, for example, you'll find that they're always depicted in a very, very similar way. So if I have an image or a statue of Buddha from, let's say, India, and I compare it to one in South America, you wouldn't know which nation they came from because they're so similar. Whereas Jesus, if he's painted in Africa, looks African. If he's painted in China, he looks Chinese, because he is reinterpreted, reimagined as the savior for all, as the person who comes to the lost in their own cultural context, using the kind of iconic artistic styles of the region and even the ethnic appearance of the region. He's very malleable in that way, and that's why I think he has influenced globally more artists than any other historical figure.
Yeah, yeah, and in his presence in art, I mean, this is just as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about it, and I'm going, his presence in art isn't like the presence of other things in art. I mean, so we see lots of things that are reproduced in art, sunsets and things like this, and animals, but Jesus has all these. It's these iconic, powerful images of him embodying what he stood for, grace and holiness and love and power, and and healing and taking care of others and
Yes, well, it's great. You've seen
yeah, it's
you've
powerful.
seen the Stations of the Cross, right, in the Catholic Church, right?
Mhm.
Which is one of the things I thought, if you look at, I don't want to get into the whole debate about the Catholic Church, but what I'm saying is that use of the Stations of the Cross is such an interesting concept for me because it reflects much of the kind of impact that Jesus had on the history of art. Because what people are doing in those Stations of the Cross is simply depicting the moments along the way to the crucifixion and resurrection crucifixion of Jesus, right? So you have these. It's that the art of Jesus retells the story of Jesus, so that you can know something of Jesus and what he actually did. So what I did is I went back. I said, let me see how much has been done. So if you take, I'm going to use Mark because it's the shortest gospel, and I said, okay, so I look at all of Mark. Let's just break this into episodes. And I looked at Mark and I said, okay, so what are the episodes? This happens, then this happens, and I got, I think, about 50 some odd episodes. Well, then I looked to see, well, what kind of art early in history appears in which each of these episodes is depicted. Well, it turns out you can reconstruct the entire gospel of Mark, every gospel, episode by episode, but you can do it in the earliest art history. And that's what's so amazing is that even you'd have to destroy, and one of the premises of the book is, hey, if I destroyed every New Testament gospel, has this man had the kind of impact that can be reconstructed? Like you can't erase him that easy. Then that's by the way, I don't think there's a way to explain that. And here's my remember the old liar, lunatic, Lord kind of
Yeah,
trilemma from C.S. Lewis. I
yeah,
think it's might have changed a little bit in how I'm trying to do this book. I think you can make the case: is he fiction, just a regular guy who lived in the first century, or God of the universe who enters into his creation? If those are the three options, I don't think you can argue. There's no other example, like I said, of a fictional character, but you also won't find another example of a mortal human who's had this kind of impact
yeah,
in any of these areas. There's no competitor to Jesus of Nazareth. And I
yeah,
want you to consider where he came from and what kind of power did he leverage.
yeah.
It's amazing. And then there's the third option, which seems like it would be, how many times have you heard someone say, look, if he really is God, then shouldn't we have had more than just four little obscure gospel authors who write this little story about Jesus in the New Testament? Well, yeah, I think you're right. There should be like a huge, huge ripple effect if he's the stone that was thrown in the water.
Hmm.
Well, it turns out there is a huge ripple
Yeah.
effect, but we just missed it. We haven't, but we did. It wasn't missed in real time.
Hmm.
But I think at our point, our cultural point today, with all the noise and all the other things you could be focused on, like I bet you can find more about the top 10 movies on Netflix right now than you can find about the top 10 episodes in the life of Jesus.
Hmm.
But that's the noise we're in.
Yeah,
And I think
yeah, it is.
we're missing the most important person who has ever lived.
Amen. And the point of this is to say demonstrably the most important person, the most influential person, the one who's shaped and changed our world more than anyone else. He never led an army. He never had any political power. He just taught, went around, according to the testimonies we have, healed. He was crucified wrongly, reportedly rose from the dead. They said they were eyewitnesses of his resurrection, and then they just went out and it changed the entire world. So maybe you
Yeah.
could give us some examples of like either medicine or science and the impact of Christianity of Jesus ultimately on those things.
Yeah, there's one of the things I think we've missed that, our way we see the world ends up either catalyzing or inhibiting our exploit. You hear all this all the time. I actually quoted Catherine Farringer in the book. She has had one of the quotes that I've always loved for years, that we would be 1,500 years further along in the sciences if Christians hadn't, held us back and burned our best minds at the stake.
Right. A
Well,
common
that
claim we get online. Yeah.
yes, and that is you have to be absolutely ignorant of the history of science to say such a thing, because it turns out that no one had a bigger impact. No one's worldview, when taken seriously and pressed into service, does more for the examination of the natural realm than the Christian worldview as established by Jesus. And you'll see this because it's not, look, there's no doubting that the scientific revolution, that's not our term as Christians, that's the secular description for what happened in the 16th and 17th century in Europe. Every modern discipline known to science was founded in this period of time. And so these are the fathers of the sciences. And if you look at them, you say, okay, that happened in one place in history at one time. And that was in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries in Europe, in Christendom. Now, of course, the argument is, well, look, if you're in Europe in the 15th and 16th and 17th century, you're a Christian. Well, yeah, but that's not the point. The point is there's far more people on the planet Earth on dirt that's not Europe. And there are far other, I mean, why didn't this happen amongst non-Christian groups in Asia or in Persia or in other places where high density of people had been for many, many centuries, even had a head start on the European culture?
Yeah.
Why didn't it happen there? It didn't happen there because there's something about the Christian worldview. People of the book who are highly committed to education, right? Because Jesus doesn't say go out and make converts, go out and make disciples, teaching them. Oh, really? I'm going to have to teach somebody? Well, what if these people don't read? Well, I'm going to teach them how to read first. Well, what if they don't even have an alphabet? I'm going to get to create an alphabet first before I can teach them to read. Well,
That's right.
Suddenly you're into this long-term committed teaching relationship with cultures just so you can make disciples. Well, that ends up blossoming into the history of modern education. And then from the first three modern universities, which are in Bologna and Paris and Oxford, all founded by Christ followers, become another 24 or so daughter universities that end up being the springboard for the scientific revolution. It's from those daughter universities that most of the scientists in the scientific revolution emerge. Look, there's a rich history of education and of a view of the created order created by a singular, orderly, rational God who is distinct from his creation. And we didn't have an aversion to studying.
Can you explain that part right there, in case somebody misses it? Why is it important that there was a pagan culture around widely outside of Israel, right? There's this pagan culture. Jesus, his life influence spreads the theology of Scripture and a view of the universe that changes how they look at the universe itself. Like you talked about, it's not a deity over there. That's something else. And what happened there?
Well, the pantheon of gods, that by the time the Roman Empire, remember, the Roman Empire was pretty religiously tolerant as long as the conquered nation would also adopt the Roman gods.
Right. Yeah.
So they understood that, hey, if I leave the culture largely in place, but now you're in submission to Rome, so I can pretty much have a great running opportunity to control your region. And so a lot of it was, well, hey, am I willing to bend my knee to the Roman god? So at least initially, there's a period of tolerance. And what that meant is that the Roman pantheon of gods was huge. And the numbers of gods and so when you see illustrations or paintings or depictions of the gods, of the mythological gods, you will usually see them in some debaucherous, drunken state, half naked, chasing women. I mean, if you read the mythologies, you'll see that the pagan gods, for the most part, don't act a lot differently than fallen humans. They are inclined to steal and lie to you and take your stuff and take your wife, your spouse, your husband, whatever it is. So they'll kill your spouse and husband. This is who they were. Very, very disorderly. Now, if the world around us, if we are simply the creation of a disorderly pantheon of gods, then why would we expect we would even have the kind of rational ability to examine the world? On the other hand, if we are the creation of a single, rational, orderly God who's created the world around us, it should follow certain orderly, rational principles that are a reflection of his nature. And then we, as part of his creation, ought to be able to be rational. We have good justification for believing we can actually investigate rationally this world and come to certain conclusions. And this distinction is that look, if every lightning bolt is just the product of Zeus getting upset, there's no distinction between Zeus and lightning, between Poseidon and the tides. Well, then there's no point in trying to explain anything, right? Well, why we have that? Well, I guess Zeus is always angry. I guess Poseidon once in a while gets upset.
Yeah, how do you predict their emotional states?
Yeah. So this idea, while it sounds like such a simple idea, it sounds like to the modern, like, well, yeah, but by this time we would have shed it, and we would have already had a different view that would have allowed us to do science. Well, yeah, but what helped you get to where you think you are now is this rich history of thought that didn't come through another funnel point. It came through the funnel point known as Jesus of Nazareth. And that's the difference. You're so far downstream in such diluted waters that you can't taste Jesus anymore. But don't mistake that for the fact that he isn't the source of the water,
Yeah.
because it turns out that he is. Now, so I think in the end, what we miss is we take for granted a worldview that seems so like we're still like Frank Turek says in his book Stealing from God. We have to sit on God's lap in order to slap him in the face. And in some ways, we are standing upon a theistic foundation that grounds our rationality, that grounds the way we see the world. Yet we want to deny it, which, by the way, is how many times have your kids living in a world that you've created for them act as though they are completely independent and don't need you? Now, maybe you say, well, mine don't do that because they aren't teenagers yet, but that's coming. So the reality of it is that
every
we
child's
still do
perfect until
yes,
they become a
yes.
teenager.
That's right. That's right. Junior higher now, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a little bit earlier. But the point is, I think we have a tendency to do that because we are prideful, rebellious people. We've always been that way. And we have a tendency to take things for granted from its source. Is that we want to think that we're the source of everything. So I think that's what's happening here in some ways. But that is something we've missed. Is we've missed the connection that a worldview that, number one, elevates the rational, that has a high regard for the material world, does not see it as so repulsive or so secondary to an immaterial world that is not worth examining. That's another huge shift in thinking also. And also did not Jesus didn't just come by. Did you notice there's a way this could have happened? Jesus could have healed by just passing by people and from a distance saying something. Of course, he did that on occasion. But he touched the lepers. He held the people who were demon possessed. He had no problem with the physical contact with people. And his followers embraced that idea quickly. Yeah. And the monasteries were replete with people who would get their hands on things, touch things. They were farming, they were feeding the poor, they were healing the sick by having contact. They did not see the material world as unworthy of their investigation. Mm-hmm. Much of the ancients did. And that also that meant that science, before it was called science, was called natural philosophy.
Right.
Because people were willing to think about these concepts, but really never got their hands in it and did experiments that could confirm what their thoughts were. That was part of the rich tradition that comes out of Christendom as well.
Now, you also talk about the correlation between where Christianity grows freely, scientific advancement follows. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the things that I am concerned about it now. I am concerned that we are in a culture right now in which, if you were to look at most scientists in academia, for example, right, and you can talk to people like James Tour, the nanochemist, or Behe, and talk to these folks and say, Michael, hey, what's it like? And are you surrounded by other believers? Probably not.
Yeah.
But a lot of that has to do with what's happening in the academy, more than whether or not the worldview is what initiates this type of exploration, or whether this worldview can ground it properly, right?
Yeah.
So I think that what I worry about is that are we now – I worry that we're getting at a point where everything has been so politicized that for political reasons we want to reject even things that are good, that are centered in a history from Christianity, but we think now they've been politicized for the side we don't like. So therefore, we're not going to encourage our kids to get involved in that. We're not going to say anything positive about the if you're talking negatively about the sciences all the time now in front of your kids, don't be surprised if they don't enter the sciences.
Right,
or
yeah.
If they enter the sciences, but they feel like they have to reject your worldview to do it.
Yeah.
We have to really understand, and this is what we're missing it. We're missing it if we think that there's no connection between faith and science, that there never has been, there never can be, and they're irreconcilable. So therefore, and then, by the way, they've weaponized that thing against us anyway. So please do not get, but that's what the enemy uses. The enemy is using science.
Right.
Okay, if we start taking that view.
Oh man, that's like when people claim and forgive me for this sidetrack, but that's when people claim that say Christmas is pagan. You're like, and you're like, well, that's not actually factually true, but because you believe that, you're sort of handing it over to others as a weapon against Christianity,
Yeah.
and when instead of using it for what it is. But I've talked to people about, tried to talk about the philosophy of science, and that there's a Christian worldview that grounds science well, and it in society it promotes science practically. And I've had people respond, there is no such thing as a worldview in association with science. There is no such. I said, well, yeah, it's the philosophy of science, and then the response is online, there is no such thing as a philosophy of science. You're such an idiot, you know. And I'm like, and I just think they don't know. They don't even know, because, like you said, they take so much for granted.
Well, even if you said there is no such thing as as a structured view that guides science, that is a view that you think is guiding science. It's really hard to step away from views of any practice, of any endeavor, and of the world in general. We all hold some lens through which we see things, and we say, well, no, that's out of bounds, based on the presuppositional lens that we're holding. Now, that's just true for everybody. I mean, it's really hard to avoid these kinds of claims about truth.
Right.
Now, all we're saying is that you have to. All of us would have to be at least open to the idea that we have to guard ourselves from presuppositions that could keep us from truth. That's it. I mean, look, in every jury selection, that's the first thing we're doing in the voir dire process, is we are simply asking this set of 75 jurors. We're only going to pick, let's say, 16, 12 for the box and 4 alternates. Okay, we have 75 or 100 to pick from. How are we making our choices? For the most part, we're simply eliminating people with presuppositional biases in one direction or the other, either for or against us, because the defensive team is doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So why are we doing that? Because we know it's why we call these presuppositional. They start. You can't get off the track. You can't get off the starting line if you hold a bias that inhibits the way you're going to run. So we have to. That's the first thing you have to. That's why the first thing I wrote in a book called Cold Case Christianity is you start your investigation with the first tool in your detective bag, which is don't be a know-it-all. Don't think I know who did this before I actually discover who did this.
Yeah.
And this is why I think, to say, for example, that anything supernatural is automatically the interaction of a divine being is just rotely out of bounds. I mean, don't I want the data to kind of guide me to make that decision? I've already decided that of all the causes possible for anything, there are certain causes I would never consider.
Right.
Well, I'm not suggesting that those are going to be the causes you discover. Maybe they won't be. But why wouldn't you leave them in the palette of possibilities until you determine which is most reasonable? I mean, I consider everything. People say, well, you never considered a ghost or a divine being in any of your homicide investigations. Well, look, why? Because it turns out that really quickly you get there and you realize that all the data points to something else.
Right.
I never got to a point where I was like, wow, the only explanation for this is something supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
Although the most popular investigative shows on TV are people who find themselves in positions where they think there is the most reasonable inference, right? And by the way, what gets me is how many of the non-believers in our world love those shows. Yeah. It's not that there's God as the supernatural. It's this other. I was telling somebody, here in California, in this crazy housing market we're in, if you get killed in your house, you have to disclose that to the realtor.
Yeah, well, someone else does because you're dead.
Yeah, you're dead, right? So your family's got to disclose, yeah, he was killed in the house. Well, why is that? Because people don't want to buy houses that have ghosts of a murderer.
Yeah, and
so all of us are like spooked. There's a point at which all of us default back to some belief in the supernatural, right? I mean, don't tell me you don't watch Paranormal the first time it came out. I remember.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
And we watched. My daughter's a big horror fan, so we were when she was in like high school. If mom was gone, we would watch horror films and eat pizza. Okay, so
I'm one of those rare people that just doesn't have any interest whatsoever in horror.
No, I get it, but I'm telling you, if you watch those things, I'm not a rational person, but you do like walk into the dark bedroom differently, you know, than you did before you watch. So in the end, we all have a sense that this is still inbounds. Oh, but if we're doing science or history, it's out of bounds.
Yeah, and it's there at the grounding, it's there at the foundation, and so what are some of the categories that you said? You mentioned art, you mentioned science. What are some of the other categories that maybe people wouldn't expect to see Jesus having this outsized impact around the world?
Yeah, well, I think that so we tried to do two things in the book, right? Number one, show that, but I got a bunch of books here on my shelves that other people have written, and some really good ones. It talks about the impact of Jesus on the world. Okay, great. I needed to know, can you reconstruct the story of Jesus from the impact? So you might say, well, yeah, he's had a huge impact on modern education, and he certainly has, because that worldview that establishes a teaching commission to teach others and disciple them. One of the most ancient texts in all of Christendom after the Gospels is a book called the Didache, right? It's the teaching of the 12 apostles to the apostles to the nations, and it was a book that was used to catechize young Christians.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, there's a bunch of principles that need to be learned by new Christians, and so that one of the first documents of the ancient church is a teaching manual. Well, this ends up becoming what happens in monasteries, what happens in cathedral schools, and then ultimately from the cathedral schools blossoming into the universities. But here's what's interesting. And I started thinking about this many years ago when I first looked at this as a non-believer, kind of, because I knew even at UCLA there were a couple of Bible verses on at Royce Hall. So I knew that, it's interesting that there would be this kind of shadow of Christianity in the educational. So how many of these schools, I wondered, were founded by Christians? That's something that we miss. I mean, if you look at the number of universities founded by worldviews that had a head start on Jesus, Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroaster, any of the ancient religious views, and compare the number of universities that they founded, even Judaism, to the number of universities founded by Christians today. It's like a 10-to-1, all the others combined to Christians.
Wow.
I think more universities, Christian universities, have already fallen away than probably have been founded by some of these groups.
Yeah, the more secular kind of either deist or atheist worldview comes in and takes over.
That's right.
And says we have to gut the Christianity out of this thing. But they're not usually starting as many things.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is they want to gut the ideologies out, which they do. I think you'd see this. I mean, the top 75 of the top 100 universities in the world today were founded by Christians. The top 15, period, were all founded by Christ followers. Yeah. But you wouldn't know that if you were to look at the curriculum in those schools today. But here's what's interesting. Universities love old buildings because that is kind of what demonstrates their authority.
Gravitas.
Their gravitas. Great way to put it. So they don't tear things down. Well, some of the most ancient buildings on every campus are the first buildings they taught classes in. Usually they're chapels. Yeah. And if you go to those buildings, you will still now a couple of them have been remodeled, I noticed, doing the research. But most have not. And you will find on their surfaces the Bible verses, the pictures of Jesus, the stained glass windows of Jesus. You can reconstruct the story. And I've got a list of what you can know about Jesus from just the campuses of the top 15 universities in the world. So unless you're willing to knock down those old buildings or completely remodel them, you are stuck with the person of Jesus on the architecture. And if you look at the charters of those schools, so from the charters and the structures, you're stuck with Jesus. He's hidden in the nooks and crannies. Now, my question is, can you reconstruct the story of Buddha from the top 15 universities in the world?
Yeah,
no, you cannot.
Probably not.
There's no other historical figure. Even if it's somebody who was venerated by, there's a building dedicated to this historical figure in that region, who was important donor to the. You still can't reconstruct his narrative.
Yeah.
But you can on Jesus. If I knew where to look and I was an alien stepping into the culture, I would go, who is this Jesus guy? Because he seems to pop up in the weirdest places. They don't even seem like they're connected. Like, how is the world of music connected to the educational system or the sciences? Yeah. Yet you'll find his fingerprints in all of those places.
Oh, I love this. So Psalm 22 has this amazing piece of kind of prophetic statement about Jesus. And it talks about sort of the death and resurrection. And then it talks about how Gentile nations will turn to God, the God of Israel, right? Because of what happens here. And it's a description of Jesus' crucifixion. And here we have just actual evidence of worldwide change and transformation and an awareness of Christ. Jesus talks about how the gospel will be preached in all the world. And I mean, we have this in the New Testament, and then we look at it, it's real life. It's happened. I mean, how hard is it to be a random Jew in Israel in the first century and talk about how you're going to change the world and then do it after you die?
And you're right. And what's interesting to me, and I am discouraged, you probably saw the same thing I saw was the last week. Maybe you've already done a talk on this, but the Pew Research comes out about every 10 years and reminds us of how irrelevant we are as Christians. And so they come out, again, and we're still continuing to decline at about, a little bit more than a percentage point a year. And this has been happening now for 2 decades. So it doesn't look, it's bleak, right? So I get it. And there's a sense in which you feel like, yeah, but see, we can now kind of erase Christianity and we can return to something else or start something else. It's not necessary.
Right.
Christianity is not necessary. It may have been a precursor, but it's not necessary.
Yeah.
But it turns out that we are so myopic that we're looking at the shrinking impact or the shrinking numbers in churches or of people who will self-identify in this nation and forgetting that Christianity is exploding globally.
Yeah.
That there's other nations that are in their infancy of their life and identity as Christian. I was listening to a podcast called Undeceptions. I don't know if you know that podcast. It's also a good podcast. And he had a scholar on, a mission scholar on what's happening in China, a scholar. And this guy comes in, or this woman comes in and says, that the growth of Christianity in China is mind-boggling, and it's hard. They haven't been able to repress it.
And they're trying.
They're trying.
They really are.
And I honestly think there's something to say about that. I think that when we act as the family of God, when we stay in that size, I think that our ability to love one another. I've been part of a mega church. I was on staff in a mega church of nearly 20,000 attendees. I've been on a church of about 350. And I pastored my own church of about 50. Mm-hmm. And I realized the church of 50, where we all knew each other by name, and our kids by name, and we're all in the same room. It feels like an extended family. If you look at your family reunions, they're usually about 50. By the time you get your cousins and your aunts and uncles, it's right around that range. Mm-hmm. And you know all of those people and their own backgrounds and their histories. You get to catch up all the time. Well, when the world watches you love each other like a family, they are transformed by that. And because the churches in places like China are relegated to house sizes, that view of familial love, I think, is really more obvious. It's harder to love people in the thousands. You don't even know them. You could pass back and forth in services. You probably won't even talk to each other.
Right.
But when you're in a church of 50, you can't get in and out of that room without being known.
Yeah.
And that makes a difference, right, in how the world sees us. And I think that's going to continue to explode in China. This scholar was saying that in the next 30 years, they might have 250 million Christians in China, making it the largest Christian nation on the planet. Yeah. Now, will that ultimately transform the way the government runs? We'll have to wait and see. But I do think in the end, they'll be able to look back 1,000 years later and go, wow, where we are right now? That all started with a Christian movement in our nation. And I'll bet you by the time we get there, they'll already have taken it for granted, and they'll already have moved in a different direction. That's what happens. We get to a point where we take it for granted, and then we think it's not necessary.
Right. Yeah. I think so too. Yeah. When I hear those polls, I think there's two ways of interpreting them. One is, first off, you should consider the world and not just the U.S. That's kind of weird. But even when you just look at the U.S., either you're thinking, oh, Christianity's dying in the U.S., or you say, oh, the U.S. is spiritually dying. Like this is not about the survival of Christianity. Has time not proven that that's not the problem here? That's not going to be an issue. It's about the spiritual survival of mankind because Christianity is being cast off. And I should say specifically, Jesus. Like sometimes there's cultural trappings called Christianity. I'm just talking about really following Jesus, really knowing and serving the one whom God sent to die for us, that we could know him and be forgiven. And what's interesting is hearing those who want to cast off the Christian influence and the Jesus influence, but they're not aware that it's not just incidental influence, it's foundational influence.
That's right.
And that's some of the things you're bringing out here that I think are very important.
Well, and this is why the subtitle of the book is not, why Christianity still matters. It's why Jesus still matters. I wanted, I guess as I get a little, I dumbed into this. I was working as a detective. I had 3 cases in trial. I was serving as a part-time youth pastor. And I met Sean McDowell. We started doing these immersive trips. I was taking these trips to Berkeley. He wanted to come on one. So I went on one with him. I was teaching students. And he said, you should write a book about this. And that's what ended up prompting me to write Cold Case Christianity. I was not like aiming at that. I was
Yeah.
still working as a detective. I just happened to I retired a couple of years earlier than I had planned on retiring, so I could enter into this world. But I can tell you that as I get older, I'm less interested in making a rather dry, sterile case for Christianity than I am about preaching the gospel and making Jesus known, and especially exposing people to the beauty, um, the ridiculous beauty of Jesus of Nazareth.
So wait,
Um,
on that note, what is then your message? You want people to know, you want people to hear, what's the thing that's on your heart?
I think what I want, well, as far as, well, in the end, the thing that's on my heart now is that the gospel fixes every kind of stupid you could imagine. So if you think there's stupid in the world, it's cop stupid. Okay, the gospel could fix that. I spend a lot of time working with police officers because I know that what ails us, it's the gospel can fix that. Oh, you think it's something in the culture? It's racism in the culture. Well, you know what? The gospel fixes that.
Amen.
Every form of stupid you can identify, the gospel has a way to answer it in a way that is so much more effective. You can develop a 12-step program for alcoholism, right? But you'll find that when they put Jesus back in it, it's not just this bland supernatural higher deity. It's far more effective because it turns out it's not all you doing heavy lifting. When you become a Christian, you now are filled with the Holy Spirit, and now Jesus is doing part of the pull. It's not just all you push. It's Jesus doing part of the pull. That makes a huge difference. And so I think in the end, that's the first message is number one, the gospel, the gospel, the gospel. And the other thing that's important is the gospel. And if we forget this, we're going to lose everything.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
in this effort, in this book, I just want to be able to show that Jesus is beautiful and accounts for all the things that you thought were beautiful, even when you were ignoring the source of the beauty.
Yeah.
And this is what we get. So how many people love, these issues of art, or these areas of culture, art and music and literature especially, right? And education and science are kind of the ways we learn to love those other three things. Well, all of that has really blossomed because of Jesus, who's the foundation. You can see this, by the way. There's a golden age within Islam that is usually described between like the 7th century to the 13th century. Some people will ground it in different centuries. But the point is, the involvement in the arts and the involvement in science particularly was unbelievable. Some of the founders of mathematics discipline, there's a lot of Islamic involvement in the sciences, and then it clicks off.
Yeah.
Why? And there's been some work done on it, some speculation on it, but I think it's largely a view of the Quran and how it's to be reconciled with the discoveries found in sciences. And we have to be careful as Christians. In other words, we could ruin this. We could surrender a bunch of areas for political, strategic reasons, which are misguided. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm also writing a book like this, is to say, hey, don't let somebody else write a story that's better than ours. Ours is grounded in Jesus.
Yeah.
Don't step away from that. So you can say once upon a time. That's all a choice. I don't think that's going to happen anyway, because I think what happens is that God is still God. Jesus is still Jesus. He's still doing his work. And if we want to step away as a nation, he's building it over there.
Yeah. Well, and I'm honestly, okay, maybe I'm the only guy who's saying this, but I think that as the world, the U.S. becomes more and more secularized and functionally atheist, even though there's still a lot of religion, it's all it feels in the realm of make believe, and it's the syncretism of, hey, let's just not argue and let's just kind of try to encourage each other. I think though, as this happens, that there's a fundamental emptiness to all of it that may lead to a real revival in the future. And so this kind of happened in the 60s, right? It's like there was a secularization and movement towards pagan or Eastern religions that ended up bringing a revival. And because there's no living water. There's no living water in these other sources, and people will feel it. And our culture is crumbling in some ways, right? Certainly people's hearts are crumbling. Certainly people's psyches are crumbling, and the need for Jesus and the grounding that comes there is growing. And so I'm hoping I don't care about the politics. I just want to see the people coming to Christ and knowing that Jesus is bigger than all that stuff. But
when I was talking to my son about this, and it discourages me, if you look at the Pew data, it's not that people atheism and agnosticism are not growing.
Right.
It's just the unaffiliated that are growing. So what
Right.
he always says, here's what bothers him: it's that it's not that people are leaving Christianity to go like another destination. They're all becoming Muslim. They're all becoming Buddhist, whatever it is. It's that they are simply leaving Christianity for nothing, to go nowhere.
Yeah.
So there does speak something to me a little bit about the way we live as Christians.
Right.
And I just, as a guy who just fell in the church at the age of 35, I get who Jesus is. I get what it is, how beautiful it is to be a Christ follower. I don't get the church yet. I don't understand why we are doing it the way we are doing it most of the time. And I think a lot of what we're seeing is not people necessarily, but for example, a lot of these folks who leave and they're unaffiliated, they don't leave a view that there's a higher power, there is a God. They
Right.
just crafted it in some kind of amorphic way in their own head. But they have not left. They're still spiritual people. They just are
Right.
not calling themselves Christians.
Yeah. And I would venture a guess that for a lot of people, it's about authority replacement. So it's, I want to replace my submission to these authorities, whether they think that that's God. More often they think it's their churches, their local leaders, and their sort of cultural Christianity, and they want to be able to fill in the gaps themselves.
Yes.
And
And
so,
even if they had a wonderful experience in church, they want to leave the authority of this
Right.
God who they didn't get to create in their own mind.
Right.
Now they create a God in their own mind. They said, no, I'm still submitting to, I think there's still a God. Yeah, but he just matches all of your desires and wants. He's you, you know, so
Right.
you're no longer
Right.
in submission to something outside of you. This rising individualism is a huge part of what
Yeah.
the problem is.
Oh
sure.
yeah. Like, which one of us out here would follow somebody when you say to them, so you're going to tell me about God and what to believe and what to do, right? And they go, yeah. Okay, so where's it coming from? And they go, well, I'm just kind of making it up on the spot.
Yeah.
You would never follow that guy, but
Right.
you're that guy. You're
Yeah,
following yourself
exactly.
down that road. It's so scary. But it's gonna, if nothing else, it'll be the kids who grow up and see the namby-pamby, make it up on the spot, empty cliche of religion that they see in their parents who departed from Christianity for a more comfortable, self-made thing, and they're gonna go, well, I know that's kind of lame. So, so I think that maybe those kids are gonna fall hard onto Jesus. I'm hoping.
Well,
But,
do you remember like 15 years ago, Mike, there was like the return, there was like you saw that even within Protestant churches, there was a return to kind of more traditional liturgies or some kind of borrowing. Like people wanted to be able to ground what they believe today in the history, the rich history, because they felt like that rich. You even saw a return to some of the people were leaving evangelicalism for Catholicism or for Greek Orthodoxy, right? Like they were making this shift, and young people would often say, or the kind of the studies, and who knows if this is even true, but the idea was well, perhaps they're trying to ground. They want to find a certain kind of transcendent permanence or something that's beyond whatever just the flighty things of this generation are. So they find themselves in these more established historic traditions. Anyway.
Yeah, I need to think more about that. I'm interested in that.
Yeah,
and what's going on there?
Yeah, well, I remember as a youth pastor, some of my kids were like talking about one of their friends had become Greek Orthodox, and he said, I visited, and it feels, well, he would say holy, and like it's so cool because this is probably how they've been doing it for thousands of years. That's what he would say.
To me, I just think oh, so like the Pharisees.
Yeah, no kidding.
And I don't mean that as a mean term. I mean merely to say that they had the outward representations that gave the sense of holiness that is purely material.
But I got to tell you, earlier this year, especially after the Robbie thing, I thought we actually toured and went back and looked at all of the rich traditions in our area, Greek Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, all of that. I thought, wouldn't it be nice to be in a place where the pastor has no social media accounts at all, and no book, no, not writing songs for the Christian music industry. There's no worship leaders who are looking for a record contract. Just an ancient group of people who are in submission to something that doesn't in the least way highlight them or feature them or elevate them in any way. Now, the problem, of course, is every time I go to those places, I cannot get comfortable theologically. So I'm like, bummer. But I think that the aspect of, hey, you know what? I'm just the local parish, whatever, bishop. I'm nobody important. Like I've got nobody, I'm like, this is an ancient view. It's a pre-social media view of what it is to be an influencer in the church.
Yeah.
And I think, there's something attractive about that to me. Am I just getting, those commercials?
I think all this stuff's interesting. Here's what I do in my head. I hear it all and I go, if the Apostle Paul walked into a church today that we think is ancient, would he
Yes.
go, I recognize that, or would he go, well, that's interesting?
Yeah. No. Exactly. Oh, listen, I
And I
totally
think
am with you on
more
that.
often
Yeah.
than not, I think they would go, well, that's interesting.
Yes. Oh, I totally agree. That's what I wonder. Well, this is why, and look, and I always say this, that although I've been in, on staff in mega churches and on staff in a house church, and that was a Southern Baptist church plant, but it was
Yeah.
a cell group.
Yeah.
There is no ugly church and there is no beautiful church. Every church has got something that it's the church. We are filled with these dirty little things called humans. So you're going to go to any one of these. Don't think you have the model that beats everybody else's, and therefore
Right.
you're right and they're wrong. It's just another way we divide from each other. The truth is that everything is beautiful, and I've been a part of all these churches. We're messy
Yeah.
because we are messy creatures.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure that the key, for my 2 cents, I'm not sure the key is in any of those things, those differences. I think the key's in um, continuing in the doctrine, right?
Yes.
In prayer, in true fellowship, in having communion together, and having godly leaders that fit the qualifications that we see, in First Timothy.
Are you
Yeah,
suggesting that the issues are theological, Mike Winger?
yeah. Well,
Come on, that's a radical idea. No, you're
yes,
right.
it is kind of an old-fashioned idea. It might be the
Yes, it
oldest
is.
of the old-fashioned ideas.
Well, and you'll notice that a lot of these churches we're seeing that we're even describing that might fit within one of these categories. If you were to go, you go, wow, why are they like, can you imagine I think part of the thing that Paul would be scratching his head about is like, how did you get from where we started to this view of God?
Yeah, yeah,
You know?
yeah, yep. So yeah, we need work, and neither of us has the corner of the market on how that has to happen.
Well, I know I'm not smart enough to suggest I would even know
Yeah.
how to start that process, but
Yeah,
but we think about it.
But your book is a person of interest, and this it should, in my mind. Okay, when I read the title, what I'm thinking is it's telling you, hey, you should be interested.
That's right.
You should be interested in Jesus, and even if you're not a Christian, it's worth it. Just like you would think, hey, there's got to be some value in reading the greats. Well, there is no greater great than Jesus. Please read the Gospels. Please read them and think about it, and don't have your cartoony version of Jesus there. There's a real Jesus who's changed the entire world fundamentally in so many ways, and just go discover him right there in the text of Scripture.
That's right.
Yeah. So, thanks so much. Oh, there's a link below if anybody wants to get his book. It's available there. You guys can check it out. I appreciate having you here. And you guys, announcement for anybody to know, I'm not going to be doing another live stream until January, the first Friday in January. That's it for 2021.
Oh, this is awesome! I get to be your last live stream for 2021.
You're the
Dude,
last one.
I feel even more special. I'm going to actually put that on my social media when I talk about this episode.
I quit for the year after interviewing you.
Yeah, it was so bad. You thought about not even. I'm never gonna. At least for this year, we're done.
We're done.
Yeah, I get
We're
it.
done.
I get
That's it. That's it. And for that, I now sign off.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate you.
Yeah. Hey.